Why Windows Phone failed in America. Imagine a company that had already built a mobile operating system long before the iPhone even existed. They had nearly unlimited financial resources, years of technical experience, and had even held a solid market share in the early smartphone era. But despite having every one of these advantages, that company, Microsoft, ultimately had to admit total defeat in the mobile market, with their market share shrinking down to just 2.5% globally before finally shutting their platform down entirely. In this video, we're breaking down how Windows Phone, despite being backed by one of the largest technology companies in the world, could fail so completely, and why even Bill Gates himself called this one of his biggest regrets. Long before the iPhone even existed, Microsoft had actually already been building their own mobile operating system. Microsoft's CEO at the time, Bill Gates, introduced a handheld PC back in 1996, running Windows CE, essentially a stripped-down version of Windows adapted for extremely small devices. This is a fairly surprising fact for many people. Microsoft wasn't a latecomer rushing into the mobile market after seeing a competitor's success. They had actually already become pioneers in this space years before the modern smartphone concept, as we know it today, even began taking shape. Between 2006 and 2008, Microsoft's mobile devices actually held a fairly solid market share, trailing only Nokia's Symbian platform. But it was exactly this success that became a hidden trap. This fairly comfortable success made Microsoft, along with the leadership at BlackBerry and Palm, become dismissive of the threat posed by a newly introduced device, the iPhone. This is an extremely familiar pattern in the history of tech disruption. Established players comfortable with their current position are often the slowest to recognize the real disruption threat, precisely because their current success makes them feel there's nothing to worry about. By the time Microsoft finally launched Windows Phone officially in 2010, they were already years behind their competitors. Android and iOS had already built extremely strong ecosystems, with millions of loyal users and deep developer support. This left Windows Phone fighting an uphill battle from day one, not because the product was inherently bad, but because they were entering a battlefield competitors had already won long before. Just imagine this challenge: building an app and developer ecosystem from scratch, when competitors already had hundreds of thousands of apps and a user base already firmly established over years. This is a structural disadvantage that's extremely difficult to overcome, no matter how good the offered product actually was. In February 2011, Nokia CEO Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, made a defining bet, abandoning Nokia's own Symbian platform to adopt Windows Phone as their primary operating system going forward. This was an extremely bold decision, given that Symbian had previously been a fairly dominant platform. Just imagine the scale of risk in this decision. Nokia was essentially betting their entire smartphone business future on a platform that, as we've already discussed, was already years behind its main competitors. This bet hinged on solving one core weakness. At launch, Windows Phone only had a handful of apps compared to the hundreds of thousands of apps already available on iOS and Android. Even basic services like YouTube and Instagram weren't available on this platform. Just imagine the experience of a consumer who had just bought a smartphone running this platform. They couldn't access apps already considered basic necessities by most smartphone users at the time. This is a problem far more fundamental than simple consumer preference. It's a genuine functional gap, one that made this platform feel far less complete compared to its competitors from day one. This situation was made even worse by reports that Google deliberately blocked Microsoft from offering an official YouTube app on their platform. This move further deepened the ecosystem gap that would continue to haunt Windows Phone for the rest of its life. This is a real example of how competitive dynamics between tech giants can directly affect the success or failure of a new platform. Not just about product quality alone, but also about how established competitors can actively make things harder for new entrants. Pressure from this situation showed up fairly quickly in the financial numbers. When Nokia's stock price dropped 75% in 2013, furious shareholders threatened to oust Elop and even dissolve Microsoft's mobile efforts entirely. Just imagine the pressure Elop faced at this point. The major decision he'd made to switch to Windows Phone instead of saving the company had actually brought Nokia to the brink of an extremely serious financial crisis, just 2 years after that decision was made. Betting everything on hardware, Microsoft acquired Nokia's handset division for roughly $7 billion in 2013. Budget devices like the Lumia 5 II briefly triggered a sales spike, but just a year later, Microsoft was forced to write off $7.6 billion of that same investment and lay off almost 8,000 employees. Just imagine the scale of this financial failure. Acquiring a business worth $7 billion, only to then have to write off nearly the entire value of that investment in under 2 years. This is one of the most dramatic examples of a major strategic bet failing completely in an extremely short amount of time. Reported infighting between Microsoft and their own Nokia hardware division is widely considered the final nail in this platform's coffin. The platform eventually shrank down to just 2.5% global market share before Microsoft finally pulled the plug entirely. Just imagine the irony of this situation. Two entities that should have been working together to save the same platform instead got caught up in internal conflict that ultimately accelerated their shared failure. Even Bill Gates himself later on called this one of his biggest regrets. He stated fairly bluntly that in the software world, particularly for platforms, these markets tend to be winner-take-all. So the greatest mistake he ever made was whatever mismanagement led to Microsoft not being what Android is today. This is an extremely rare and fairly surprising admission, coming directly from one of the most influential figures in tech industry history. This admission confirms something important. In technology platform markets, failing to move fast enough at the right moment can carry extremely permanent consequences, even for a company as large and wealthy as Microsoft. Microsoft kept Windows Phone on life support until October 2017, though insiders say the platform was effectively dead long before its official end. This is a fairly common pattern for failed tech products. The official shutdown often comes years after the real momentum has already fully disappeared, because a company needs time to genuinely acknowledge and accept a failure that's already become obvious to many outside observers. So what's the big lesson we can take from Windows Phone's total failure? This is a cautionary tale about how being late to a platform shift, weak marketing, and an empty app store can sink even a tech giant with nearly unlimited resources. Microsoft had every advantage that should theoretically have made them succeed. Years of technical experience in the mobile space, massive financial resources, and even a partnership with one of the largest handset manufacturers in the world. But none of these advantages were enough to overcome one fundamental problem. They were late to recognize the real disruption threat, and by the time they finally moved, they had already lost the critical momentum needed to build a developer and app ecosystem strong enough to compete. This story teaches us that in winner-take-all technology platform markets, momentum and timing can be a far more decisive factor than financial resources alone. Once a competing platform successfully builds a strong enough ecosystem, catching up becomes an almost impossible challenge to overcome, no matter how large and wealthy the company trying to catch up actually is. If you enjoy global tech business case studies like this, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss other case studies on global business successes and failures. See you in the next video.